Hello, everyone. Our debate is on person first versus identity first language preference. My name is Gabriela Castillo, and I'm currently working as a behavioral technician at a high school in a special education classroom. I have been in the ABA field for over 3 years now. I have worked in different settings such as clinics, homes, and school.
Hi, everyone. My name is Callie Hancock, and I'm a clinical operations manager at an in-center ABA facility, and I have worked in the ABA field for 2.5 years.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Kantonovichis. I have been an RBT in Nevada since 2016. I've worked with clients in the home, school, and clinic setting, and I've worked with clients between the ages of 2 and 20 years old with diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, ADHD, mood disorders, and intellectual disabilities.
Hey, I'm Carissa. I earned my undergrad in special education with 12 credits of ABA, which quickly converted me from teaching to ABA about 4 years ago. I am now a bilingual clinical supervisor working with Spanish-speaking neurodiverse individuals ages 2 to 21, as well as their families. For this debate, I am the researcher and will be sharing data and outcomes from studies addressing our topic of person-first language and identity-first language. Person first, or PFL, refers to, for example, person with autism, where the person comes before the diagnosis. Identity first, or IFL, refers to, for example, autistic person, where the identity is a part of the person. We will use a combination of PFL and IFL throughout this debate, depending on the information being presented. One study on PFL versus IFL records what people say or write produces specific versions of the world, oneself and others, and language conveys, shapes, and perpetuates ideologies. In our debate today, group members will advocate a stance on PFL versus IFL preferences, which they believe are using the most correct language to support disability rights. A disclaimer to note before we begin, cameras may need to be turned off at certain points throughout the debate due to unstable internet connections.
Okay, so I'll be start by presenting some examples and tips on how to use people first language. Utilize people first language is a way to emphasize a person, not the disability they live with. Examples of people first language include saying, person with a disability instead of a disabled person or handicapped person. Person who uses a wheelchair instead of crippled or confined to a wheelchair. Person who's blind instead of the blind. Person with autism instead of autistic person. People first language fosters an environment of dignity, respect, and hope. It is more accurate when describing people with disabilities and placing the person first is helpful in eliminating stereotypes and influencing our impressions of them in a positive way. People first language reduces stigma. Describing someone in terms of their disorder and not first recognizing them as a person is stigmatizing.
Identity first language is used to acknowledge that one's disability as how they identify themselves. It is used when an individual has no shame in who they are and bases who they are around their disability. Rather than saying, I'm a person with autism, one would use identity first language and say, I am autistic. Identity first language can be used across a variety of individuals. An example is an individual saying, I am blind, rather than saying, I am a person who is blind. Or I am schizophrenic versus person first language, I am a person with schizophrenia. More examples of identity first language can be seen in the visuals shown here.
What is people first language? As the name implies, people first language puts the individual first and the disability second. Focusing on the person rather than the disability aims to end harmful generalizations, assumptions, and stereotypes. Why is people first language recommended? It is the most respectful terminology. It emphasizes the person first rather than the disability. It highlights a person's value, promotes individuality, since one's individual's life with a given disability can differ markedly from the other person with the same disability.
Identity First Language, which will also be referred to as IFL, is language that puts an individual's disability first as a form of a description to who the individual is. Identity First Language allows the individuals to promote their diagnosis and not be shamed for who they are. Identity First Language promotes connection, camaraderie, and a shared purpose amongst individuals with the same diagnosis. IFL brings awareness to the differences across individuals. The use of IFL reduces the stigma by discussing one's disability through language. Throughout the research articles found, most autistic individuals surveyed stated that they preferred the use of Identity First Language, as their diagnosis was a part of who they are and not something to be ashamed of. Botha and colleagues provided quotes from individuals with autism that support claims for a push in using Identity First Language. Carly, a 21-year-old female, said, "Autism makes me who I am. Yes, autism is an integral part of who I am. It affects the way I think, communicate, and socialize." Polly, a 32-year-old woman, said, "Using person-first language suggests that autism is inherently a bad thing. When you say they have, it comes under the disease perspective, like they have cancer or they have MS."
Person-first language is not widely preferred in promoting the concepts of medicine by medical professionals, organizations, and advocacy groups. Such language is intended to avoid equating patients with their disease or conditions. Why should we use person-first language? It does not objectify the person by that condition, and it gives them more ways to identify themselves. By placing the individual first, the disability relegates to a second characteristic. Why is this person-first approach important? Someone's experience with autism might be substantially different than other person with autism, so that referring to them as if they were the same is inaccurate. Thus, the focus on the person and not his or her disabling condition impairment is key, and in any case, one characteristic, whether positive or negative, should never be defined overshadowing others. Let's jump to the next slide. Disability advocacy. The idea of person-first language started with the disability is natural community. They explain that each person is much more than their diagnosis. Identifying someone as their disability or diagnosis first is at best inaccurate representation of who they are, or at worst, a slur or way to put someone down. In general, person-first language works within disability definitions by taking about the person first, then the medical diagnosis. Putting the person first when describing someone with a disability or disease can positively influence the image and impressions we form about them. You may say person with a physical disability instead of crippled, or person with a conjunctive disability instead of mentally retarded. Let's go to what words define who you are? The color of your skin or your hair, your age, your weight? Or of course not. The words alone define a person that results in a label that often reinforces barriers created by negative and stereotypical attitudes. Every individual deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of gender, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, hair color, or anything else. Using objectifying language linked to disability is not different than segregating people by race, ethnicity, religion, or any other label that ignores individuality and promotes a stereotyping.
When individuals use Identity First Language, it assists in reducing the stigma by being transparent about what makes an individual themselves, by entailing pride in who they are. Identity first language suggests a decision amongst individuals to practice choice over the destiny of a disability by promoting positivity amongst one's diagnosis. By using identity first language, it gives individuals a sense of empowerment and reduces the likelihood of discrimination. The push for identity first language is to bring self-reflecting freedom and moral independence. Many self-advocates are pushing for the use of identity first language to reduce the view that there is a problem with having the diagnosis. Vivanti discussed that identity first language promotes a revolutionary change in comprehending autism. The use of IFL encourages positive social identity and reduces the likelihood of dehumanizing individuals with a disability.
I will be presenting some research on person first language. There are two studies here who support person first language preference among the majority of their participants. This first study was conducted in the Netherlands, where participants speak a non-English language, aka Dutch. It aimed to stretch autism, person first, and identity first research to a non-English speaking country, as many other studies have only been conducted in English speaking countries. Participants included over 1,000 adults ages 16 and up with a formal diagnosis of autism and almost 300 parents. Recruitment was sent out via email to all individuals registered in the Netherlands Autism Register, or NAR, which is a longitudinal database for children and adults with autism living in the Netherlands. Table 1 provides some characteristics of participants. You'll notice that both education and IQ levels are high across participants. Adults are predominantly female and the children male. For the materials and methods, there was a questionnaire and it was sent to participants and reads as follows. It was translated here from Dutch to English for the publication of this article. The questionnaire said, the questions below are about the portrayal of autism. Which label do you prefer when it comes to people with autism? 1, people with autism. 2, autistics. 3, autistic people. 4, someone with Asperger's, PDD, NOS, or MCDD. 5, none of the above. 6, other, namely, blank, fill in the answer, which was then recoded as person first, identity first, or other, depending on the answer. And you can see from the options which ones represented person first and which ones represented identity first. Some of the major limitations of this questionnaire included that only one response could be chosen, and that the question itself uses person first language, indicating possible influence on the responses. The results show that a combined total of 71.4% of participants preferred PFL. And we see that this preference towards PFL holds true among all participants. So among the adults and the parents. People with autism was the most preferred by both autistic adults and parents, whereas autistic people was the least preferred by both groups. And each of those were less than 6% that preferred autistic people. Demographic data from the study did not reflect differential preference among the different demographic groups. For the discussion and limitations, the authors discuss how a traditionally modest, sober, and conforming Dutch culture may affect the outcomes of the study, as IFL and the neurodiversity movement are often associated as being more progressive. Recruitment for this study was conducted through the NAR database, which annually sends out a questionnaire to all on the register. This contrasts with other person first and identity first language studies, which often advertise and/or actively recruit participants for this topic. Again, the questions and answer choices were limiting, as discussed previously. In this study, Perspectives on Person First Language, a Focus on College Students by Hoffman. The aim was to examine Midwestern college students' perspectives, awareness, exposure, and use of person first language regarding disabilities. Online surveys were sent out with a total of 595 respondents. Of these participants, the majority were female, white or Caucasian, and or undergraduates. Knowledge about disabilities in this study ranged from not knowing anyone with a disability to themselves living with one. Because of the varied participants' disability experience, 4 main themes were derived about the use of person first language. The first theme, theme 1, was opposition to person first language. This theme was derived from about 10% of the respondents. Most of those who responded with opposition were younger than 20 and or they knew someone disabled who took offense to person first language. Theme 2, however, was in support of person first language as one of the main themes of this study. About 62% of participants indicated support for this terminology. Comments from participants in support of person first language indicated the importance of creating an accepting, positive environment, valuing the person first, and having empathy. The third theme is the expansion of person first language to a more broad perspectives. Several students commented on other subcultures who use person first language, indicating that across several areas, including race, medical settings, and learning environments, person first is the respectful way to speak. The last theme, theme 4, is the individualization of language to support individuals with disabilities, which supports letting individuals guide the way others speak about them. One participant stated, "I haven't thought much about using person first language because I usually refer to people with disabilities by their name." And in both of these studies, the conclusion at the end was that we need to be identifying individuals in the way that they prefer. So what research supports identity first language? When reviewing the identity first language preference research, similar themes as were described in the person first language preference of respecting human dignity stood out. I will present data from 2 of these studies as well. Autism is Me, an investigation of how autistic individuals make sense of autism and stigma. The goal of this study was to interview and examine how autistics themselves feel about and view autism and stigma. The participants, there were 20 participants in this study with ages 21 to 62. Gender were 9 male, 9 women, 2 non-binary. Diagnoses were 12 with Asperger syndrome, 3 with autism or pervasive developmental disorder. 1 was in assessment for autism and 4 were self-diagnosed. Their race and ethnicity were 13 white British, 1 black British, 5 white, other from Europe, America, Israel, or New Zealand, 1 mixed race South American, and their sexual orientations included 13 heterosexual, 4 bisexual, 1 pansexual, and 2 left their sexuality undisclosed. Although only 20 participants in total, they represented several different demographic groups, which hopefully will give us a better idea overall. Okay, so for the methods and data analysis, originally face-to-face interviews were the only interviews going to be conducted. However, the authors received permission to also use email and text messaging to interview to reach more individuals without the need for those individuals to have social contact. 9 interviews were face-to-face at the University of Surrey in England. Face-to-face and audio interviews were recorded and later transcribed. So online interviews were via Click Meeting. There were 8 audio, 1 text message interview, 2 email, and then again, the 9 face-to-face interviews. In each interview, only the interviewer and participant were present to maintain anonymity. Constant comparative methods were used to analyze data at the beginning and throughout to compare participants' interviews and add questions to the new interviews as themes arose. For data analysis, NVivo 10 and 11 software was used to manage and analyze data. NVivo is used for qualitative and mixed methods research. First, open coding was used to code each line of transcription from every interview. Next, axial coding found commonalities between the interviews, which ultimately led to selective coding, which highlighted the core categories from the participants, which is where the results were extracted from. The results show that, a direct quote from the author, while some participants did not have a strong preference for any particular language, most did, and most preferred identity first language as the less stigmatizing of the two. No participants preferred person first language, as all found it in some way demeaning. So again, to repeat what Callie had said, Polly says autism is intrinsic to who I am. Using person first language sounds like a disease, and that autism is an inherently bad thing. Polly later says that person first language is dehumanizing to autistic people, condescending for person first language people to be like, remember guys, this is a person in front of you. Abraham says that in support of identity first, being autistic is a person's feature. Polly says autism is not a disease. And Michael says that they do not see, neurotypical people do not see autistic people as being on a different tack. It sees us as being wrong. Because until being diagnosed, I viewed myself as a misfit, a retarded genius, an eccentric, a freak. I saw no future for myself anywhere. But then May says, the spectrum gave me a new identity, which I view as a mostly positive identity. For the discussion and limitations, a major conclusion was there's a desire for reclamation of pejorative autism language, with participants advocating a refusal to bow to the terms that non-autistic individuals thought they should use, meaning that autistic individuals want to guide the use of language regarding autism. For limitations, participants were recruited with knowledge of the study topic. This may have led to stronger identity first language preference due to wanting to advocate for the neurodiversity and identity first language movement. The authors mentioned that they wish they had more time to continue with the study and that they had wish that they had begun with a focus group of autistic individuals before conducting interviews to further add to the research. This next study is exploring an e-learning community's response to language and terminology use in autism from two massive open online courses in autism education and technology use. So the aim of this study was to understand who is using what language about autism. From a mass online learning community, 730 individuals from 2 different classes responded to the survey. Participants were categorized as either self-advocate, autistic, family or friend of autistic, or professional who works with autistics. The results are clear that self-advocates prefer autistic as well as the majority of their family and friends. However, professionals tend to favor person with autism on the autism spectrum and ASD ahead of autistic. And again, between these two studies, the final line was that autistic individuals should be guiding the language that is used when referring to them.
Okay, so this is the Q&A portion. What value does the individual's thoughts and opinions of identity first person first language have on the language used? Autistic people across all ranges of speaking with or without learning disabilities should be directing the language used, using either approach or a mixed approach until you know that a group or individual has a preference. Question 2. What does the research support? Current research is inconclusive about language preference, as there is a relatively limited number of studies on the topic, and most that do exist do not have enough diversity for a valid conclusion. Question 3. What information limits current studies? Current studies show that the majority of autistic individuals prefer identity first language, and those studies are limited to high functioning individuals and do not include responses from nonverbal individuals. I would like to note that nonverbal individuals are the most vulnerable to having their human rights violated. Many studies are affected by cultural impact. For example, speaking different languages, you may put pronouns in different places. Question number 4. What does the American medical system support? Person first language is currently supported in North America for research and scholarly work. There is a lack of agreement among researchers and clinicians regarding a respectful way to refer to people with a disability, especially ones with autism. Ultimately, if an individual has a preference, their choice of language should be used. Question 5. What does the autistic community support? In countries outside of the United States, there is an increase in the use of identity first language among disability rights communities. There is a movement of support for identity first language in the United States among the autistic community. Question 6. What ethics guidelines apply to person first and identity first language? Ethics Guideline 1.07, Cultural Responsiveness and Diversity, ensures that the behavior analyst continuously learns and increases knowledge regarding cultural responsiveness and diversity to ensure that there is no bias to individuals. Ethics Code 1.08, non-discrimination, ensures that behavior analysts do not discriminate towards others and remain open-minded towards individuals based on gender, age, disability, ethnicity, identity, immigration status, relational status, national origin, race, religion, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. Question number 7. Why does identity first person first language matter? The words we use to describe individuals with autism spectrum disorder influences society's perception, policies, clinical practices, and research. Many behavior analysts use term flexibility in their work by discussing the preferred use of language with the participants in their research and then honoring their preferred choice of language. Question 8. What are the downsides of person first language? The individual may not prefer person first language. It's based on the idea that disability is something negative. Person first language has been challenged by self-advocates with autism. And typically desirable attributes are expressed through pronouns preceding nouns. For example, beautiful person can be seen to perpetuate society's view that the diagnosis itself is a negative attribute. Question number 9. What are the downsides of using identity-first language? The individual may not want to be defined by their diagnosis. It promotes stereotyping, and it promotes essentialism, which means the disability becomes the most essential aspect of the individual's identity. There's also a lack of relevance to some groups and individuals with autism. And our final question, number 10. What is neutral across both subjects? If an individual has a preference on how they choose to identify, their preference should be the largest factor. People with disabilities may be in different stages of their disability identity development, depending on their own personal, cultural, economic, and disability factors. Both sides are advocating the same intention, which is to be respectful. So in conclusion, person-first and identity-first language reflect a common intent to depathologize autism and inspire respect. Vivanti, 2020. Person-first language emphasizes the person by placing them before their diagnosis. Kyle has autism, for example. Identity-first language places the disability as the focus and allows the individual to claim their disability rather than have others select terms with negative implications. For example, autistic individual. Behavior analysts are encouraged to use terms and descriptions that honor and explain the individual's perspectives. Language should be selected knowing the individual's preference takes precedence over professional language styles of choice. Here is a list of the references we have used to guide our presentation. Thank you so much for coming to our debate.